Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the podcast. Best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I'll recommend you purchase the annual. You get a discount, and that's one of the biggest and best ways to help keep Geopolitics and Empire going. I produce a weekly analysis on world events, and every week or two, I organize a Zoom meeting with supporters only, so you can join calls and we can, off the record, shoot the breeze, discuss what's on your mind, what's going on around the world. You can donate through the website, purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about anything, and do check out all of my affiliates. Above Phone for de-Googled phones. They got Linux laptops, I think Linux tablets, eSIMs, Wise Wolf Gold for precious metals, and Escape the Technocracy's got great courses on escaping the technocracy. They're having a sale right now, I think. You get a discount with my code, and leave a podcast review if you haven't already on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to the podcast. Share Geopolitics and Empire and follow on all the socials. Joining us for the first time is Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski, who teaches philosophy and humanities. His books include Modernity as Apocalypse, Sacred Nihilism, and the Counterfeits of Logos, Words, Concepts, Reality, Aristotelian Logic for Teenagers, and his latest book, which we'll be discussing today, COVID-19 and the War Against Reality. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Dr. Kozinski.
Thank you so much, Herbo.
And yeah, you got it. And before digging into your book, anything you want to tell us about where you're coming from, your background, your work?
Yes. So I wrote that book beginning pretty much with March 2020, and I started writing, and eventually created a Substack and just kept writing. Therapeutic, spiritual warfare, just trying to get the word out. And, when things stopped, right, when the lockdowns were taken away, and I recognized that there were some themes there that were common in my writing, and it seemed like I could put it together to publish it. And I tried to do it earlier on, and nobody wanted it. There was a lot of resistance to telling the full truth, like a couple of years ago. But I found a good publisher and was able to get it published. And I'm kind of a classical educator. You may have heard of the Trivium, Grammar, Logic, and Rhetoric, great book, Socratic Method. I've dedicated my life to Socratic philosophical teaching. To help people escape Plato's cave. And that's I always teach starting with the cave to my students. My background is Christian Catholic, and I integrate Catholic spiritual and theological principles in my cultural and philosophical analysis.
All right. And I'd like to say about your book, I just finished reading it, and it offers for me an entirely new dimension on COVID-19 84, separate from many of the other books of the guests that I've had on, like David Hughes and others. And so I highly recommend your book. I loved it. I think you and I differ maybe on a few things, but I like to discuss what we agree on. And if you don't mind, I want to quote at length from some sections of your book, and maybe to start, before you give us your sort of thesis. Someone who recommends your book. I guess it's in the beginning of your book. You have a number of recommendations. One of them comes from Professor Peter Simpson, who writes, "The book discusses the perceived rise of a global totalitarianism under the cover of the COVID pandemic, framing it as a spiritual and moral crisis that challenges the concept of objective reality and sacred truth. Literally everything they told us in 2020 and after was a lie, and these lies were aimed at the total subjugation of society and human souls. It was the installation under the cloud of a medical, the AI is going to get me here, hoax of a new global and totalitarian religion, commanding and coercing our obedience to its great lie, to fear and hatred of all that is true, good, and beautiful." And then you write, "How can we account for this hell on earth, overseen by psychopathic technocrats and their willing slaves, orchestrated by demons and their occultist worshippers on Earth. This was something unimaginable before 2020. I've been racking my brain for years to answer this question, and this is the best I can come up with. God is mercifully revealing to the world the naked and brutal reality of our collective choice, both personally and corporately, to live in opposition to Him, to choose unreality knowingly and deliberately. This unreality is administered to the world by globalist elites using the latest propaganda technology and a panopticon-like surveillance and censorship apparatus. The effectiveness of their creation of unreality can be gauged by the success of their twofold big lie, namely that there was a deadly pandemic and that asymptomatic transmission could ever be a real thing, a lie that gave these psychopaths total control of the world economy, as well as all the other major institutions of governance and culture. So with that being said, if you want to tell us wherever you'd like to start, what happened and what continues to happen, what's going on.
Yeah, well, in terms of who did what and the details of the geopolitical, I think that's not the emphasis of my book. I touch on it, and the kind of people you've had on your show, David Hughes, for instance, has written the definitive book on that aspect, I think. So if you want to learn about the nitty gritty of the players and how they pulled it off in a kind of human evil sense, the strategies they used, the psychological tactics, the coordination, the hierarchy, who was ultimately behind it. I mean, the work of Catherine Watt is also excellent, and she's been able to show that it was ultimately organized on the ground level by the Department of Defense. It was a military operation. I think that's pretty clear now what this was. It was a military psyop, torture, mass terrorism. And then you have all the economic aspects, the complete transfer of wealth from the middle class to these elites, the technocrats, and so that's all been covered. What I try to do is to sort of say from a spiritual angle, like, I mean, why did God permit such a thing? What's going on in terms of God's providence in permitting this? What does it tell us as believers? What is the message, that we need to decode in such a thing? And it's not only just the level and extent and ubiquity of evil and the nature of evil. It's sort of staring at us in the face with this thing, if you look at it correctly. But it's also the effect it had on the populace, especially those who you would have thought would have resisted this, would have been able to have the spiritual discernment to understand what was going on. The greatest shock I had was the extent to which my fellow co-religionists were complicit, not only just helpless victims of a kind of unprecedented sophistication of propaganda, overwhelmed of it, and the use of terror and fear and scapegoating, but the way in which they kind of embraced it, almost as if it were kind of a cult, like a salvific cult, as if they had no clue that this was satanic, ultimately. And it was a kind of, it played the role of like a counterfeit salvation. It had a very clear mythology behind it, a kind of Manichaean good and evil was described and delineated for us. The whole thing was, in a sense, shrouded in fear of God, but of course it wasn't God; it was this virus. And one was invited to take on a kind of moral attitude with certain gestures, and it's almost liturgical. The mask wearing, lockdowns. It really had all the earmarks of a kind of religious cult. And I understand people who are godless and who are starving for some kind of ultimate meaning in their lives, such as what Matthias de Smet talks about, right? People are alienated and isolated and living these meaningless bullshit jobs and his bureaucratic managerial culture of meaningless trivia and sensuality and eroticism and just this overall malaise. And something like this comes along, and all of a sudden you have heroic duty. You could be a hero. It makes sense to me why so many people with that mindset would have been uh, manipulated to give their identity, their thinking, their judgments over to these priests, right? These infallible dictums of this new secular priesthood, medical priesthood. But why did so many, not just mainstream religious people, but even a lot of believers, even a lot of strong Bible believers, seem to not recognize what was happening? And again, this was analogous to 9/11. 9/11 has similar mythopoetic religious aspects to it. But and I remember the same kind of thing. Do you realize what's right in front of you? Um, Only now are more and more people waking up to the fact that those buildings were not demolished; they were turned to dust. If you see those videos, they're turned to dust in midair. Literally, that was not a paradigm that one could comprehend. And I think is a similar thing. The truth of what was happening was kind of clear, but there was this I don't know, satanic eclipse of reason that just came over the whole world. And even the best of us, as the Bible says, even the elect might be deceived, right? So that's kind of what shocked me the most, and I really wanted to make some sense out of that because it was scary, actually, like very frightening to me. It was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? One minute your neighbor was somebody you thought you knew, and the next minute you're dealing with someone who seems absolutely psychotic and possessed, and you can't reason with. Um, and these were people within your own church. These were your priests, your bishops, the Pope, the one who called himself Pope, who just died today, was um, one of the most influential proponent of this lie. It's just incredible.
I've got to know just on 9/11. I've often said that, COVID 9/11 was let's say, I mean, this has been going on a long time, but 9/11 was like the first shot in that sense, where it was let's say, the first building block, real big
Yes.
building block of the security, the global totalitarian surveillance state apparatus. And I often say, I call it COVID 9/11 was like phase two. So it was just a
Yes.
continuation. You in your book, you write the 2001 episode of medieval atavism was only a prelude to the full scale regression of the entire globe in 2020. And back in March of 2020, I posited that the main goal of COVID 9/11 was to implement advance the digital technocracy. So just any thought on 9/11 and COVID 9/11 sort of being connected?
I don't think it could have worked the way it did, the great success it had in the brainwashing indoctrination without the kind of preparation. 9/11, like you said, is kind of a building block, a John the Baptist for this satanic antichrist. And yeah, I sensed that too. And what was interesting is the way in which the full understanding of what was happening, which is only coming about recently, I think, right, as this thing settles in. But I remember thinking this makes 9/11 look like Disneyland. Um, I thought the scale of coordination and the sophistication of the propaganda and the way they used fear and terror was just this was the flagship. This was the ultimate 9/11. You can't get anything get more powerful than this. And I couldn't imagine nothing prepared me for this pandemic and the effect it had on people. And so I do think that it prepared the way. I mean, it does seem to me that what we're dealing with is a kind of sorcery. And there is an elite group of sorcerers. I got this idea from Thomas Breidenbach. He wrote the foreword to my book. And he has an unpublished manuscript about 9/11, which is incredible, 3-volume work. It's his life's work. And he goes back and looks at the history of sorcery, and he looks at Rene Girard as well, and scapegoating. And his thesis is what we're dealing with is at the top, at the very top of the elite structure. You know, what is a sorcerer? It's someone who creates a kind of pseudo reality that you live within. I mean, the sorcerers are Hollywood, of course, and the media, but this was a kind of real life act of sorcery, 9/11, and it was an experiment. I think. I don't think anything of the like was done before. What we were dealing with is obviously a smoke and mirrors campaign using very high level technology in terms of 9/11. I think the work of Judy Wood is rather compelling with the directed energy. I think that's the only way to explain the dustification of the buildings. But I'm not completely sure about this. I don't know. I don't want to get into the details, but it was definitely an act of sorcery. It used numerology, Kabbalah. There's some books on this. The Most Dangerous Book in the World by S.K. Bain goes into the occult aspects of it. Was a black mass, a ritual, human ritual sacrifice, and I mean, just think of that paradigm when you're trying to understand some of these events. But my eyes were open to that possibility of a kind of black magic sorcery, and I think COVID-19 was similar, and I really don't think it would have been as successful um, unless it was preceded and prepared for psychologically in the communal consciousness. I mean, these mass trauma events don't go away. They stay in the collective mind. They stay in the emotions. They stay in the psyche, in the people's souls, and they could be forgotten about or repressed. But it has there's a memory there, and that memory, of course, was uh, you know uh, manifested also in all the movies that were made and the kind of commemorations, and 9/11 becomes a official mythology. And so that same fear was triggered by COVID-19. So it was a different kind of terrorist, a more ubiquitous, more sinister, more deadly in a sense, possibly your neighbor. I mean, it was just absolutely, completely diabolically brilliant what they were able to do. Um, Instead of love of neighbor, it was fear of neighbor, distrust, and instead of love of God, it was fear of this invisible, all powerful, amorphous, God called SARS-CoV-2. And the masks were the sacramental of purity and protection and righteousness and solidarity. And um, of course, the vaccine becomes the sacrament, the Eucharistic communion in a sense. And, the way in which people believe the 9/11 narrative, regardless of whether it was true. I remember there was a quote that Kevin Barrett mentioned sometimes by, I think it's a psychologist who wrote some articles on the kind of psyche of the 9/11 denier. And you tell them the what really happened, and the person says, I wouldn't believe that even if it were true, kind of thing, right? That's a kind of strange perversion of Christian faith, where the evidence of things unseen, um, and it's not as if Christian faith asks you to believe in anything against your reason, but it does ask you to trust in realities that supersede and transcend your reason. And so the diabolical inversion of this, of course, is to have things that contradict common sense and reason and all traditional understandings of things, the Tao, and then have it be that you're superior for believing it anyway. And that's what we saw in 9/11 and in the scamdemic as well.
And you mentioned about the occult, and for me, I think that gets really close to hitting the nail on the head. I've borrowed from former occultist Mark Passio his term. People, listeners know I like it because for me it overlaps with the biblical worldview, where he calls this elite the occultocracy, and more specifically, he said in streams the technocratic occultocracy. And there's people that focus on one ethnic group. And they focus a lot on the Jews, but there were times in history where Jews were powerless, right? And so I think it's just a smorgasbord of all these different groups, and they're united by this occult really ideology. And something you talk about in your book, counterfeit, right? So you write, in truth, the hell on earth that emerged in 2020 is precisely what any society must have when the true sacred is replaced with the false one. I think you're right. We're fighting to the death now for the right not to define reality, but to reality itself. I mean, and even this weekend, I was talking with some friends, and it's just kind of like we're surrounded now by this false reality, and it's really in our face, trying to get us to accept it. And the second you leave your house, I mean, even in your house, you're fighting to say no. I'm not participating in this. This is your thoughts on this counterfeit.
Yeah, it's everywhere, and it's getting more and more obvious in some sense, but more subtle in other ways. Um, it's very scary. You're right, and you have to. I mean, I'm wary also about the overreaction, the black pill, as it were, right? Because that can also be part of the psyop. People are adopting a kind of irrational fundamentalism in reaction to liberalism's demise in Christian circles, where they want to hold on to something like a kind of formula for how to negotiate these things, and it's just not the way it works. You there is no ideological um, uh, key to understanding and to negotiating all this. It's just bricolage. It's you have to just manage as you can, and what the evil here wants you to embrace some sort of idol, uh, and without you recognizing it. That always seems to be the modus operandi of evil here. If you can see through one counterfeit and idol and reject it and recognize it, there's another one waiting for you, that you think is just, oh, I've discovered the truth. I'm out of the cave, but it turns out to be another cave. And I'm not saying that there isn't escape. There has to be. There is. But um, it's kind of by going through and going through all this and just suffering with it, and um, doing the kind of research wherever you can, to go deeper into things. But ultimately, um, it does have to be a kind of surrender to and trust in God. Like that's the thing that's becoming more and more difficult as things get worse, as the buttresses, the bulwarks of the last vestiges of sanity and Christian culture are removed. Um, it's gonna be difficult, but we have to practice right now, learning how to be mystics, and learning how to recognize God's presence and His guidance in the midst of all this, um, without turning towards anything less than God. And of course, when I saw the church herself giving in the human element of the church, right? I still believe the church is divine and has a kind of untouchable core of divine protection and holiness and truth. It's because that's indefectibility, it's called in the Catholic tradition. But I don't know. The greatest shock and sadness and source of anger was when the Pope was when Jorge Bergoglio made those statements in which he kind of mocked those who didn't want to wear the masks and take the vaccine, and said that they were not being good Christians, and that was really something else. As if this evil had infiltrated the very precincts of the Holy of Holies, in a sense. Now, I have my opinions about the late Jorge Bergoglio, God rest his soul, and the whole question of the status of his papacy. But that's another rabbit hole. um, but but yeah, the counterfeits. In my other book, I call them the counterfeits of Logos. Logos is the reason of everything, the order, the fundamental structure of reality, moral, spiritual, psychological, ethical. And obviously, these sorcerers, who are not all in one ethnic group, as you suggested, um, but that's a whole other question. That's serious as well. But in, the sorcerers are at war with the Logos, um, and they don't want to just. This is another theme of my book. They don't want to just terrorize us, impose counterfeits on us, make us miserable, torture us. They want us to believe in these counterfeits and, in a sense, worship them as a substitute for the reality that they've rejected. They want us to reject reality as much as they do. They don't get to have their full pleasure and enjoyment unless our souls are very damaged unto damnation, and they can't do that. No demon, no evil elite can actually um, cause damage to your soul directly. You have to be the one to do it because it requires deliberate, knowing consent, and that's what they want. So with 9/11, they wanted us. This is kind of revelation of the method stuff from the Michael Hoffman. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, Secret Society, Psychological Warfare. He calls it the cryptocracy. There's the cryptocracy, and then Mark Passio's occultocracy. Same kind of thing. But ultimately, what they would like you to do is to believe in the lie that they parade in front of us, knowing it's a lie and believing it anyway. So that, like that lady's statement, I wouldn't believe that even if it were true. So for them to do that, there has to be a kind of bad conscience. They have to seduce us into having like bad faith in a sense. So when I was analyzing 9/11, and my second book has some of this in there, the story that we were given, the narrative, made us righteous. It gave us a mythology. It gave us a sense of heroic suffering and being on the side of the good against these evils. It really just did a lot what religious mythology does. And it also permitted you to sort of have a kind of salvation through identifying with the victim, which is, of course, the Girardian insight about all counterfeit religions have a scapegoating and a victim. The Christian version of this is that you should side with the victim, but you're the one who victimized the victim ultimately, and you're not the victim. Christ is, and so siding with him doesn't mean that you're not guilty. It just means that you accept your own guilt and his innocence. So the counterfeit of this in 9/11 was siding with the innocent America that was attacked. Um, in its heart, crucified by these Muslim terrorists. And all you have to do is hate them and believe in your own goodness because you're all about freedom. Um, and so if you were to explain to somebody why that story can't be true, they would look at you and almost say to you, I don't care if it's not true. It's serving its purpose in my soul. That's what I care about. Don't bother me with its truth. Now that's treason against Logos. And of course, that was the same with COVID. I mean, maybe even on steroids with all the insanity of it. So that to me is what like a satanic liturgy is all about. It's Christian liturgy. The truth is present. It's there. You can go deeper into it, but there's no deception, and it's not secret. It's not Gnostic. Um, Whereas the satanic liturgy is always a kind of occulted, deceitful series of half truths that you believe, even though you know they're half truths, and that's why I think they permitted this revelation of the method of it. You know, which you can see patterns of this in many of the deep state events.
And what you're discussing, again, I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of your book, and I haven't really come across it elsewhere. When you talk about this counterfeit, and I mean, we're dealing. It's like a cult, whether it's the 9/11 event or COVID 9/11, and how it transforms the masses, brings them into sort of this Luciferian type of cult. Something you talk about is higher level versus lower level awareness. You write, if you deny that we are now living under globalist totalitarianism, you are beyond the reach of argument. And this is something I deal with a lot, listeners that deal with. I mean, I'm here like voices in the wilderness. The walls are closing in, and nobody cares. Everyone's clueless. You talk about it. No one's got a clue. And you continue. You say, my thesis is simple. The only plausible explanation for the totalitarianism we have witnessed, and which will soon be reactivated with another manufactured crisis, is that we citizens of so-called liberal democracies have become the ideal subjects for it. The general public is being reduced to a state where people not only are unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable to search for the truth because they're satisfied with deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language. The main reason for where people stand today vis-a-vis reality is the state of their souls vis-a-vis God. And so just any further thoughts on the lower level awareness, what can we do? Because I've always been fascinated is like, why do some of us understand what's going on and others, they have this lower level of awareness, and it's a variety of things. They don't know, but they also don't care to know. It's like that. Is it from Plato's Cave?
Yes.
or one of these other stories where you try to tell them the truth and they hit you?
Kill you. Yeah. No, that's Plato's Cave. Yeah, he comes back into the cave to try to tell them what he's seeing. And the interesting thing is, when he does that, he can't see the shadows anymore that well. He's sort of like unable to detect what's going on in the cave, right? And they interpret that as he's become stupid, like he's actually lost his mind and he's become less intelligent, less aware. And then they make fun of him. It's very interesting. You think about it. That sounds like what you're saying. So, look, this is something that I love to discuss and think about. I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer to this. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. Okay, but what we can do? I mean, obviously, if you have come to a certain amount of it, I don't want to get into the whole unenlightened thing and like New Agey stuff. That's a little tricky. I mean, it's pretty clear. The thing that we're being enlightened about is not some esoteric secret knowledge here. It's very obvious knowledge. It's just love, like love and truth, right? So it's very simple. Are you someone who thinks that truth is authoritative? Okay. It should be the case that every human being um, cares for truth more than anything else. So, like, when he makes statements, um, when he looks around the world, he tries to find what's true and tell what's true, because it's an authority. It's not powerful. Power is different from authority. I have a chapter on this, on power versus authority in the book. I mean, truth doesn't coerce, it doesn't compel, it doesn't insist, it doesn't manipulate. It just is there, present to you. And you either see it as obliging you to defer to it, to love it, or you don't. I mean, this is Christ with Pilate. What is truth? He says. What he meant was, why is truth obligatory? There's no answer to that, of course. It's the Nietzschean question, because to answer it is to already believe in truth. So it's a question that actually just it can't be answered, because the only alternative to truth being authority is violence, is coercion and violence and power. Um, and relativists don't argue; they impose. They have to. And a relativist is just someone who doesn't consent to the authority of truth. It's not that he doesn't know what's true. That's nonsense. It's that he doesn't accept the authority. There's a good definition of unbelief by Joseph Pieper, German Thomist, 20th century German Thomist. That was the quote we read from, by the way, by Joseph Pieper, The Abuse of Power. And he says that unbelief is a sin, not because you don't believe in the truth um, of what's being told to you. It's that you reject that truth as authoritative, even though you know it's true and comes from God. Um, it's the satanic move, right? It's, look, God, no, non serviam. It's not, I don't know what the truth is, or I need more evidence. It's I say no to truth itself. And of course, that's damnable, right? That's ultimately, every sin is really a version of that. And so, I mean, we live in a culture of liberalism. I talk about in the book a bit. That my second book was mostly on liberalism and the nature of it, the history of it, and philosophical analysis of it. But I mean, ultimately, what liberalism is that truth becomes a choice, um, or not an obligation, a preference. Um, it becomes something that you can take it or leave it. Truth itself, logos itself. And if you choose to believe in logos, you can live that way. No one will take your stuff and persecute you, ideally. And if you don't, you could also be a citizen and live. But that's not true. Um, and it's not true because those in power um, are going to impose force through law, based on some conception of the good, which is ultimately theological. So liberalism is really a kind of ultimate sorcery. Like, there is no such thing as the liberal state. And I think maybe that's another reason why God permits 9/11. They had the face of the devil, right? Have you seen that face of the devil in the building, the smoke? If you look that up, it's a pretty amazing image. And of course, the COVID, the scandemic, has many demonic images and just icons about it. And it's like God saying, look, if you want to see the true face of the so-called secular, liberal, progressive, scientific uh, culture, you know, it's a child suffocating in a mask, and it's you know bombing of children. Um, I mean, that it's the ultimate imposition of irrational force on a mass scale that's really the face of what we have here. So of course you might ask, well, what is the alternative? Everybody says that. Do you want to go back to the Middle Ages and you want to have the throne and altar united? Are you a monarchist? That's all. No, that's all nonsense. That's reactionary. Um, the answer, of course, ultimately is to just make sure that you and me, in spite of the programming and in spite of the great incentives to put something over truth, anything, we don't do it. We just don't do it. I mean, that's the martyrdom. And I saw this happening in seemingly minuscule events like I'm not putting that over my face. I won't do that. Oh, come on, man, just put on the fucking mask. Come on. No, I won't. And it's not because it's uncomfortable. It's not because, I couldn't do it, but I won't because it's untrue. I won't do something that's just untrue. Um, Unless you force me, I guess. I don't consent, at least, but and that was happening all over the place, you know. Um, and so there's little treasons against truth that this evil was getting people to commit, right? It's the devil. I mean, that's the devil right there. That's how I saw it was happening. I mean, of course, you have evil people, as David Hughes talks about. These are these technocrats, these kind of Nazi communists. He sort of gives this background of where they came from, and he talks about in his other book that the similar thing was happening in 1930s Nazi Germany. The same group, um, they use whatever system they have to bring about the totalitarianism, whatever economic political system. It could be fascism, it could be communism, or it could be capitalism, and that's what it is today. A certain form of corporate stakeholder capitalism, as Michael Rechtenwald has a really good book on that. So yes, look, they are the enemy, right? Okay, I get it. I get it. But I also understand that we are the enemy because there was complicity in this, just like in 9/11. I mean, we didn't orchestrate poison bioweapons, okay? But every time you wore the mask and maybe felt good about it, that's complicity, right? That's serious business to do that. That's a betrayal of logos. And to see the Christians do that, in the name of Christ is just a whole nother level of perversion.
And that was what was going through my mind during COVID. I wouldn't do the math. I wouldn't comply because precisely what you just said. Because it's a lie. I'm not participating in this.
Yes.
Even now, when it comes to voting, I have 3 countries I can vote in. I'm not voting anymore because I feel we're already under an oligarchy. So me participating in this simulation, whichever party wins, they're going to implement the same project. That's a lie. I'm lying to God. I'm lying to myself. The same with the masks. Back in 2017, I've told this story once in the podcast. The Mexican, I was moving to Kazakhstan, and the week before, I had a U.S. plated car. It was illegal. Long story, but they could have impounded it. And the week before I leave the country, the Mexican transit cop comes and he says, I can impound your car. And I was so giddy. I was like, take it, impound it, apply the law. And he wanted a bribe. And when we just stood there like two in the Wild West, who's going to budge? And I was with joy. I'm like, yes, take it. I'm not paying a bribe. And he ends up buying it from me. And it's kind of like, but I'm not going to pay the bribe because, that's part of that participating in this lie.
That's a good example. Yeah.
And let me ask you something you also write about in your book that made me think this related to what we're talking about. You talk about well-being versus salvation. You quote from, I think, Adolf Guggenbull Craig, and he talks about as goals, salvation and well-being contradict each other. You talk about how people just seek well-being, happiness, and I think that's part of these people that you're describing versus those of us that, no matter what the cost, we put truth number one. You mentioned whether it's martyrdom or persecution, and in the book it says the path to happiness does not necessarily include suffering. For the sake of our well-being, we're urged to be happy and not to break our heads with questions that have no answer. A happy person sits at the family table among loved ones and enjoys a hearty meal. And I really like this here. It says, a person who seeks salvation wrestles with God, wrestles with the devil and the world, confronts death, even if all of this is not absolutely necessary at that precise moment. And then elsewhere in the book, I'm skipping ahead. Yeah, you continue talking about the mode of well-being is a living hell that leads to eternal hell. And I think that's one thing that differentiates some of us where I don't care what the cost, my job, money, I need to know what the truth is. I got to wrestle with, the death,
Yes.
whatever. And I think that's one versus people who just want to, hey, let me keep my job. I'll keep my head down. I'll be a yes man. I want my comfort. I want to be able to travel. So I'll take the medical, miracle. Just any thought there?
Oh yeah. I mean, and the truth is not just some like abstract philosophical thing that you just, your head's in the clouds and you don't care about the world. It's like, no, the truth is everywhere. It's in every particular judgment and action. There's a sense in which you could ask yourself, is what I did true? I mean, you could say, is it good, right? Is it useful? But knowing the truth is very much about the details of life. I mean, it's the practical virtue of prudence, Aristotle calls it. It's an intellectual virtue. It's the kind of intersection of truth and goodness, you might say. It's where they meet, right? Because the reason we act is according to our will choosing a particular good, a particular moment that is ordered to another good, that is ultimately ordered to what we think will make us happy. And there's nothing wrong with happiness, okay, as an end. It all depends on what that means and what constitutes happiness. So, for instance, the Christian understanding of happiness is it is our goal, but we attain it by a gift from God, grace, who permits us by our consent to be transformed into Him, and into a kind of intimate union with Him. He is happiness. We're only happy by participation. And so, and the paradoxical path to happiness is somehow bound up with the cross, which seems to be the opposite of happiness, right? This is the paradox of the Beatitudes, of course. And well-being is part of happiness. It's a part. I say that in that essay that like that person who's enjoying a meal with his family, that's a good wholesome pleasure because conversation and festivity, celebration of kin is beautiful and loving. But the difference is that itself is a kind of participation and an icon of a kind of a higher union, which is ultimately God. And if you take that lesser good and make it the ultimate good, that's the definition of sin. Even if it's a genuine good, like it's not evil. Isn't just like the way it's portrayed. It's choosing a lesser good over the higher good. It doesn't mean the lesser goods aren't goods. It doesn't mean there's not a place for them. Okay, that there is, but the therapeutic kind of mentality of well-being. You know, we're actually seeking that feeling of satisfaction and happiness instead of seeking to be the kind of person who's worthy of happiness. That's a huge difference, right? Alistair McIntyre is really good on this. His latest book talks about this quite a bit, but it's all throughout his writings. The modern view of happiness is I basically am satisfied. I have a sense of well-being with my life, right? And the classical view would say, do you have a right to feel satisfied? Have you conducted yourself in such a way that the end result should be a sense of satisfaction? It's not the sense of satisfaction that's the criteria. It's something else. It's virtue basically. So the only people who are deserving of happiness are the virtuous. And so the purpose of life is to seek to be virtuous so that you're worthy of the gift of happiness, not to go directly to seeking that state of well-being. And that's a subtle distinction, but our whole culture is bound up with inverting this, right? Corrupting it.
Yeah, I've always just, even as a young man, just for me, the number one was the truth. And Dr. Paul Kirk Roberts, who's been a frequent guest on the podcast, I think in his newsletter, he often says something like, truth is my country. And again, you write in your book, this really, I think, takes it home. You say, damnation comes from putting yourself under the authority of untruth, whose father is Satan, the father of lies, who was a liar and murderer from the beginning. And it is one's attitude to truth that distinguishes the mode of well-being from the mode of salvation. In well-being, one puts truth second to everything else, as you're saying. Truth is never first. Perhaps it is an authority, but it is never the authority. In salvation, truth is always first. You mentioned again, secular liberalism. There's a lot of in your book on that. You quote. There's a lot of great stuff. Chad Pecknold, D.C. Schindler, who writes, we propose that there's literally nothing good about liberalism per se. There's nothing good about it because, first of all, and according to its essence, is seen as a total rejection of Christianity, as is possible. It is not a reality, as we have seen, but a negation of reality, perhaps a contrived conspiracy to negate reality. To put this in an extreme formulation, understanding evil in the ontological sense of the privation of goodness, we could say that liberalism is evil as a political form. You've said Lucifer's coup de grace would be saved for our century. This, what's going on, and just ultimately, as you said earlier, it feels like, C.J. Hopkins talks about this. It's like the mask is coming off, and we are now in this process of being exposed to evil in its most total, purest form, just total, absolute totalitarianism. We're on that train. It's headed to that final destination. You talk about something I often think about. What's this mechanism between Satan and the elites? And I've been thinking this the last few years. You write it in your book. You say, it's all gone. It's all gone. It's all institutions, schools, businesses, hospitals, governments. You talk about the global program of discourse corruption was a top-down agenda orchestrated by the elites of technology, corporations, intelligence, media, finance, medicine, science, academia, the agencies, WEF, NIH, CIA, WHO, FDA, CDC, of all the countries, right? Not just America. And, you talk about, the think tanks, Rockefeller, CFR, City of London, Zionists, Freemasons, it's not just, it's all of them put together. And then you talk about Antichrist, and you say, you wrote on your Substack I think yesterday, there will never be a reckoning, and you basically say that it's that we're on this progressive course. Things are just going to be getting worse. Your further thoughts here?
I mean, I don't feel like I'm a prophet or I have a crystal ball. But the evidence suggests that there's just no way institutionally that there could be a reckoning. David Hughes recognizes this, and he says there has to be an absolute revolution, violent revolution of the masses against the elites. and that the purpose of his writing is to instigate this. And I have some sympathy with that view because this is not something that can be legally adjudicated. I think it's an illusion what we're seeing with the Doge and that kind of thing. It's not going to be what it's promising to be. And I think what's her name, Solari,
Catherine Austin Fitts. Yeah,
Catherine Austin Fitts is very good on that. She's really astute on that kind of thing. And so. I don't want to say this, is this a black pill? No, it doesn't mean that God could do whatever he wants. If God wanted to dismantle this whole thing and make it look like he did it by secondary causes, I guess he could, make it look like it was just a human triumph of justice. But it doesn't seem like that's the story at this point. The Antichrist has to come, and all that has to happen. The church has to go through the passion, which she is going through. The infrastructure of Antichrist has to be set up. It's so obvious that the digital biotechno, how do you want to say this? biomedical technocracy is all about this, the sign of the beast, what is wait a minute, the mark of the beast. There it is. It's got to come, and it is coming, and that I guess in my article I was saying, why hasn't there been a reckoning here? What just happened? I mean, it's been forgotten. It's like it's never happened. That's not a good sign. Okay, that's not a good sign. We're in trouble. The calm, this fake calm we have now. Do you realize what we just went through here? Do you? I mean, there are people who see it. You see it, and the people, Twitter has a lot of people who get it. Substack, but I don't know. I'm trying to get prepared for the next level. Right? Doesn't there have to be a next one? I don't think we're done here, and I don't think that the next one will be predictable because COVID wasn't predictable. And so I'm also not going to be paranoid. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing and keep telling the truth to power and keep resisting. God uses these little efforts we have. If he wants to destroy this, he can. But, there's a reason he doesn't. And that's precisely what I'm trying to get at is, in a way, what God was saying was, look, I want you to recognize my reality, my presence, my power, and I want you to recognize that you're nothing without me. And if I can't get you to recognize this through tender love, I'll show it to you by telling you what it's like, showing you what it's like, having you experience what it's like when my presence is gone. And I don't know about you, but there were moments during the pandemic where I felt like it was literally hell. And I know people have gone through much worse, the Gazans and people in wars. I get it, but psychologically, spiritually, it felt like hell. And there's a sense in which the spiritual and psychological torture is sometimes worse than physical, right? Um, and so I think God permitted that. He did it on 9/11. He wanted us to take a good look at the face of evil and recognize that can only exist because God exists. I mean, so it's the sort of negative revelation, you might say. And so I think maybe we'll need that again. And yeah, it's not a happy thought, but I think it's true. I think it seems like it's true when I'm saying it. There's not going to be like look, JFK, 9/11, all the deep state events. There's been no reckoning for any of them. These sorcerers have got away with every one of them.
I mean, I just everything that you're saying here, I just see eye to eye on you with, and I've been talking about it a lot. And some people can't handle. I think part of it is maybe they don't have a spiritual. I say my white pill is Jesus. They don't believe in God or Jesus, so they have a hard time where they're going to find their hope or their cope. And I'm just I can't this is as you're describing in your book. This is the actual reality. There's nothing's been reckoned with. You write in your book against whom there is no secular or political hope whatsoever. You write, I've been racking my brain trying to figure out how we can get out of this seemingly inexorable spiral to complete enslavement and unimaginable horror. My conclusion is that we cannot do it ourselves. We're in a collective state of perfect possession, the Antichrist religion, a global and totalitarian spiritual stranglehold that will absorb every aspect of life, politics, economics, culture, health, science, education, etc., will make no truth claims yet demand full adherence of intellect, heart, and will to its dogmas and commands. And it's said that it's going to come. I mean, there's no, in an earthly realm, us staving it off. Ultimately, it's a supernatural force, external, metaphysical, God. Jesus, who, as you sort of just alluded to, saves the day. And I think you say they're going to do it again. It's going to be a surprise. And another point you made, we should continue living our lives, paying attention to this stuff.
Yes.
Not living in the bunker, 24/7. Right. And then you say, you said, you talk about something. I always talk about this. You say that totalitarianism and wickedness will become unimaginable, resembling something worse than a synthesis of Hunger Games, Blade Runner, 1984, Brave New World, Mad Max, The Road, and The Matrix.
Did I miss any? Like Saw, I guess. Like let's add some. Let's add some more to that.
Yeah, and and then I always come down.
Oh, we could add Severance to that.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch, but and then you say one thing. You say, if what I am saying is true, what shall we do to prepare ourselves?
Yeah.
And what you write is, I this is what I've believed. You say physically and economically, we need to do what we can to become as self-sustaining as possible and to live on the margins, lest we be complicit with and co-opted by a techno-leviathan antichrist system that will be ubiquitous and inescapable. There will be no place to run, really, but we need to get out of the main Sodoms.
Yeah.
And so that's the physical part. And I think that's all we can do. And then, but the most important reason to prepare is not for the sake of temporal and material well-being. That's essential, but to safeguard our psychological sanity and spiritual integrity. And so, I think
we also have to be available to others too. They have to know where we are. We have to be available to them. What I've seen in the traditionalist movements is a kind of schismatic attitude towards them, and it's not healthy. It's not good. It doesn't mean that you just intermingle and compromise. I mean, but there has to be a kind of charity and sense of our neighbors here. I mean, look, I do say people are complicit. Okay, I was complicit. We all have been somewhat complicit with this, but we have to still be lights in the darkness, and so we can't just run away. So whatever that means, like I teach in a public charter school, and so it's good because we have a kind of core group of conservative type of people who get stuff. But we're in the system a bit, and we're kind of undermining it from within. I kind of like it, and just versions of that. I think we have to kind of work on, and everybody's got their own way of dealing with it. But again, it really comes down to the spiritual and the aspect of truth. There's going to be all these different ways that God is asking, do you love me? Do you, and they're not small. They're not the little ones are the little thing. You think they're little, but they mean a lot. And that mask was just, to me, was the ultimate. Like it was like oh man, I can't get over how evil the masks were. And it doesn't really seem obvious, like just this piece of cloth, but something so diabolical about that whole project. Yeah.
I had a guest of UK column, Alex Thompson, former GCHQ. He's Christian, and he said when I interviewed him a couple years back, he said, "Practice saying no to petty tyranny," and I think that overlaps with what you're saying. Say no to anything that's false. And it's I've lately I've been using this example. Anywhere I go to the shops now, I'm here in Mexico. They ask you for your phone number to buy food or bread, and I'm like, "What? No." I think it's related because the reason they're asking you for that is part of the same digital ID social credit system. And I have to say, force every single time, I'm like, no. I'm like, I'm kind of made to look like the weirdo. Everyone else is giving their phone number. Why don't you? And I'm trying to make them feel awkward. I'm like, no, like it's crazy. You also talk about there's no solution to the evil we face. I don't think there is a human solution. A lot of people who listen to the podcast are like, they tell me, well, what's the solution? Well, what's your solution? And we can, I don't think, we're going to be steamrolled over this. And my hope again is I got my parachute, my jumping, my space, my, what is it, Blue Origin space, my space shuttle is, Jesus and his space shuttle. But, and any other thoughts, some things that maybe a theme that we haven't touched on, anything else you think that's important?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm an advocate of classical education, and so I think it's important to have weapons and to have your mind sharp. And classical philosophy is really helpful for that. And I have a chapter where I go through all the different philosophical errors and talk about what the implications are and why we should fight. Because what we're dealing with is our ideologies. And ideologies are kind of like, I guess they're similar to egregores, you might say, right? You heard of that phrase, the egregore. Have you heard of that?
No.
Egregore. Yeah, I guess it's not as popular. An egregore is it's more popular than New Age, kind of the New Agey types, like the conservative ones. The ones that are kind of fighters, but they're still New Agey. Kind of Gnostics, like Mark Passio. He's a little bit like that. But the egregore is it's like a constellation of ideas, but it sort of has a life of its own. Like it kind of like an organism, and it sort of just possesses people, and it seems to have almost like an agency to it, like a demon, except it's kind of not, it's not a demon. It's sort of between like the demonic and collective consciousness or something. And that's like what ideologies are, right? They sort of infect, they're like cancers. They seem to have a kind of organismistic structure to them and dynamic. And, you know, to recognize an ideology and name it, and to talk about like its history and where where it was born and where it came from, and these are ways to unmask it and diffuse it and ultimately conquer it. And that's kind of a philosophical martial arts, spiritual cycle. So I would just say it's good to read classical philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, the medievals. It's called the perennial philosophy, and begin with Plato. I mean, everybody should read Plato's Republic at least once. It's a tremendous work. And Socrates was a hero of Logos, a hero of truth. He put truth first, and he was trying to teach everyone how to do that. And yeah, and I just remember that ultimately this isn't a recipe for pacifism or indifference, but power is subordinate to authority, and authority doesn't have power. It's not about power. It transcends the dynamic of power. It's more powerful than power, you might say, precisely because it doesn't get involved in the earthly dynamic of power. So the ultimate example of this is Christ and Pilate. It was authority talking to power, and it's very important to recognize that, because one of the boasts of these evil people is they're the authority. They don't, like I said, they don't just want to impose their will on us. They want us to accept them as authority to replace God. That's what they want the most. And there's no way they can get that unless you give it to them. Like, we're always free to reject that. And so they ultimately don't have that much power. It's an illusion. And just like I said in the book, just think of everybody, or most people in March of 2020 just said, no, I don't accept this. It would have ended. And then the question is, why didn't people do that? And you couldn't get everyone to do it. There's no way that you and I tried to like convince people to not accept this as authoritative. And I couldn't do it. And that's bracing. That's scary. And you know who else can't do that is God. God literally cannot make us recognize his authority. It's the one thing that he leaves himself powerless to do. And I think that's important to meditate on. He can't do it.
Yeah, and I mean, what you I just lost my train of thought, but what you were saying about people, I mean, we saw examples, pockets of. I always go back to. I just remember this because I'm living in Mexico in 2020 in Mexico City. I mean, massive city, 25 million, right? And the mayor there attempted to implement this rule. So we saw it work in other jurisdictions, but in Mexico City, it didn't work because it's such a massive population, a lot of cattle to herd and control, and they tried to obligate people. If you enter any like business, a restaurant, convenience store, pharmacy, supermarket, you have to scan the QR code before entering. And because just such a mass of people, like no one complied. And then after a week, the mayor's like, okay, just kidding, never mind, and
Yeah,
so.
there it is. There it is. Yeah.
But
Wow.
I think it's again where you mentioned sorcery. The Bible talks about delusions,
Yeah.
and it's. I don't think we can't, as you say. There's no way to get people not to. They have that critical mass. There's no way to stop this critical mass from going along, and then the rest of us, we're just going to have to ride along on that train and do our best. As you talk about in your book, to survive. And so any final thought for us? And I subscribe to your Substack. I highly recommend people go out and get the book. Physical, or I think digital version, is available.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Thank you. No. Yeah. Just this has been really enjoyable. And yeah. Don't. I mean, the truth is there. It exists. Socrates said that the worst evil that any human being can commit or be subjected to is what he called misology in Greek. Misalogos. So mis is an anti, right? So anti-logos. And what he meant by that is the mentality in which you stop inquiring, searching, loving truth for whatever reason. You grow tired of it. You think there's no answers. Whatever the reason is, you begin to not see truth as a primary obligation. And he said that's the worst thing that can ever happen to you. And he thought the sophists at that time were really creating a culture of this. So that's why Plato wrote everything he wrote to fight this. But he also, I think, saw this happening in the future. And remember, I think the upshot of all these psyops and everything that's happening, and why God's permitting it, is ultimately to test us, and to see whether or not we're going to put truth first, because that's what he wants. And again, he can't force it. And you might say that this is his version of forcing it, right? Like by permitting these evils. But it's a merciful imposition, because the only place we could go is into his arms, really. I mean, if people had that attitude during the pandemic, we would have won, because God's power would have, shown through us and conquered all this. So how many tries are we going to have? And am I going to pass the next one? I don't know. Um, I hope I can stay humble and dependent on God, and that's why I wrote the book, to share that message, to help others to try to be that way. Because I wrote that book through a lot of suffering, and so it was my best work because of that. And God allowed me to write some good things. So I'm really happy about it, and I'm so happy you gave me this time to talk about it.
And is it? Yeah, I listened to your interview on Kevin Barrett's show. I've interviewed him on my old TNT radio program. I think you mentioned that
with Breidenbach, the one with Breidenbach.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned
Yeah.
that you can't leave Amazon book reviews anymore. And 2 years ago, I had one of my guests, he's former CIA, J. Michael Waller, and I left a book review, and it's the first time it ever happened to me. Amazon deleted it, and they sent me a threatening message saying, if I ever wrongly leave a book review again, I'll be kicked out of the Amazon community. Is that also what happened to you?
Yeah. I cannot write any book reviews anymore, and I think some of the reviews on my book aren't getting published too. Actually, that happened. Tom Breidenbach wrote one, and it wasn't published for like a long time. So I actually contacted customer service and chatted with one of these women, and somehow she put it on. She put it up. I won somehow. I just said, why is this person not able to? So anyway, who knows? Yeah, but I only, yeah. If you do read it, I'd love this a review. That would be great. Get it popular, because it's yeah. I think it'll help people, this book. So thanks again.
I'm going to try and leave a review. And yeah, same thing happened to me. I tried a second time on J. Michael Waller's book, and I think it took like a month or more. Eventually,
Yeah.
it popped up. But
Yeah.
again, the links to your Substack are in the description. Again, the book is from Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski, COVID-19 and the War Against Reality. Thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for your work, man. All right, take care. God bless you, man.